Look around you. So much of our modern world is new. New ideas, new buildings, new narratives. And that's great. Change is necessary for progress. The whole world gets it. So how is it possible that despite all this progress, we still learn in the exact same way our grandparents did? Our education is evolving so slowly. But why? What if your education could evolve and improve as quickly as the world around us does? What if your education was designed to help you discover who you really are? If students were created like co-creators instead of just products? If there was a space meant to build connections between teachers and students? A place where safe space doesn't mean you'll be shielded by censorship. Where liberty isn't just what you learn, but how. Your education should keep up with the rest of the world. And now, it can.
Buenas tardes, es un verdadero placer darles la bienvenida a todos los participantes al día de hoy en esta conversación sobre un tema de suma importancia. Y antes de proceder, quería agradecer a la Fundación Naumann Centroamérica y también a Guata Activa por su colaboración con o junto a el Centro para el Análisis de Decisiones Públicas, o CADEP, de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín. CADEP es el centro de investigación de la universidad y que cuenta con investigaciones y también eventos tanto en la ciudad de Guatemala como en el interior del país sobre las ideas de la libertad. Y les invito a todos que sigan a CADEP UFM en las redes sociales, pero también a la Fundación Naumann y a Guata Activa. Quisiera invitarles a todos ustedes también a participar. Ustedes pueden dejar sus preguntas y sus dudas en el chat de Facebook y también en YouTube. Y bueno, vamos a abrir muy pronto también un espacio para preguntas para ustedes. Vamos a tener, o tenemos un invitado muy especial el día de hoy. Tenemos a Flemming Rose y voy a seguir en inglés. Entonces, siempre pueden ver también la conversación en YouTube y Facebook con subtítulos. Entonces, bueno, vamos a proceder. Y bueno, Flemming Rose is a Danish journalist, author of The Tyranny of Silence, and in my humble opinion, one of the most prominent defenders of free speech. He studied Russian language and literature in Copenhagen, and from 1980 to 1996, he was the Moscow correspondent for the newspaper Berlingske Tidende. In 2005, as cultural editor and later foreign affairs editor, at the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten, he decided to publish a series of cartoons that initiated the Mohammed cartoon controversy, leading to a series of death threats and other repercussions. He later published an article in reaction to the controversy called Why I Published Those Cartoons, and more recently he was a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and now I have the great honor of welcoming him. Flemming, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for the invitation, Olav. It's very nice to be with you. And in fact, I visited UFM in 2017, and I have very fond memories of that visit.
That's where we met, and I noticed, Flemming, you spent 16 years in Russia. We're going to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's where various of your ideas were formed, no? So let us begin just with the most basic of questions. When did you form, you yourself, your ideas on free speech? I mean, you were in Moscow, you were in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union fell, which is special as it is. And I imagine that is where you formed your ideas on censorship, self-censorship, and the importance of free speech. Is that true?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I grew up in peaceful, democratic Denmark, where we more or less used to take freedom of expression for granted. And as a young student, I went to Moscow, and I spent a year in Moscow in 1980-81. And when I came back, I began working as a translator for the Danish Refugee Council. with refugees from the Soviet Union, and through that work I got in touch with dissidents inside the Soviet Union and dissidents who had been kicked out of the Soviet Union and were living in exile in Western Europe. And I think that was a defining experience for me, because these people had suffered for standing up for the right to express their opinions, and they had paid a very high price. Some of them lost their jobs, some of them lost their social environment, some of them were forced to exile, and some of them even died in labor camps. And I formed a huge admiration for these people, and what I also saw in the Soviet Union was what I back in 2005 identified as the key problem in the beginning of this process. That is the challenge of self-censorship. That you can intimidate a society to an extent so that people they are so afraid that they do not want to say what they really think and believe in the public domain. And all these conversations, they took place in kitchens, walking in the woods, things like that. So yes, I think that my experience with Soviet totalitarian society in the 80s was very important.
And people were then self-censoring themselves. I mean, they would express their ideas in private, in the woods or in the kitchen, but not publicly. Just why is free speech, why is avoiding self-censorship so important for society?
Well, I mean, there are several arguments for free speech, or why freedom of expression matters. You have three traditional arguments, and one argument is the argument from truth. That is also John Stuart Mill's argument that you need freedom of expression in order to pursue the truth. And you need confronting opinions in order to find out what is right and what isn't. And then you have the argument from democracy, that in a free and democratic society it is important that public opinion is formed on the basis of the opinions of people living in a society. And then finally you have the argument from autonomy, that it is important for us as individuals and human beings to express our opinions in order to take responsibility for ourselves and live with the consequences of our opinion, of course, without being prosecuted or put into jail, but for our opinions. I think that is what makes us grow as human beings. But then there is a fourth argument that I find especially important, and that is freedom of expression as a tool to manage differences in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious society without resorting to violence when you have to solve conflicts. And I think in today's world, with ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity, and the digital world that makes us all virtual neighbors, I think this argument for freedom of expression as a tool to manage diversity in all its forms, that is, to me, maybe the most important argument for freedom of expression in the 21st century.
Okay, excellent. I would like to briefly reflect on what happened with the Mohammed controversy. I understood from various of your interviews that you've chosen to publish the cartoons as a statement against self-censorship, because you saw a tendency of increasing self-censorship in your own country, in Denmark. So can you describe the events in the run-up to the publication your expectations after publishing the cartoons, and how your world has changed after the publication.
Yes, I returned to Denmark in 2004. I had been a foreign correspondent for 14 years, living in Russia, the Soviet Union, and the USA. I hadn't been part of the debate about integration, immigration, Islam, and so on and so forth, because I had been living abroad. But at the time when I returned to Denmark, Islam, immigration, how do you live together in a democracy when you have different norms? It was a big issue. And then in the late summer of 2005, a children's writer in Denmark, went on the record. He went public saying, I have written a children's book about the life of the Prophet, but I had big difficulties finding an illustrator because illustrators expressed fear, they exercised self-censorship, and so on and so forth. And that was a big story in Denmark. It was on the front page of every newspaper. And then a public debate started. Is there self-censorship or not? Some people were saying, no, it's not a problem. It's just people want to be polite. Other people were saying, well, there is self-censorship and it is a problem. And the problem with self-censorship is that it's invisible unless people are honest about their motives. And in order to move that debate further, I decided to invite Danish cartoonists to draw the Prophet as they see him. And I received 12 cartoons, and they were published September 30th, 2005. And at that time, I would say, you have this principle in journalism: don't tell, show it. And as an editor, as a journalist, if there is a problem, if you hear about a problem or a fact, you want to find out if it's true or not. And this was a very specific way to answer, I think, two questions. Is there self-censorship or not? And if there is self-censorship, is that self-censorship just a product of people's imagination, or is that self-censorship grounded in some reality? And today, I think it's obvious after what has happened in Europe and around the world within the past 15 years that the answer to both questions is yes. There is self-censorship, and it is founded in a very brutal reality because people have been killed in France, in Denmark, and for my part, I have been living with bodyguards around the clock for the past 6 years. I also had a security problem earlier, but after the killings in Paris in January 2015 of the editorial staff of Charlie Hebdo, a French satirical magazine that republished our cartoons, I think 12 people were killed in the editorial office, and since then the security situation has changed dramatically for me and for people in a situation similar to mine.
You somewhere you briefly mentioned that you definitely not regret defending free speech by publishing the Mohammed cartoons, but you did stated that you would have modified your strategy a little bit in retrospect. I'm going to cite you. So you said, I thought we could change the situation and win this battle. Now I understand you need growth and support in society in order to fight intimidation. I know that from my own life in the Soviet Union. If you want to dilute the fear and the threat, you need more people to challenge it. They, the opponents, cannot come after millions of citizens. How do you reflect upon this now? Do you still have the same feeling about what happened in 2005?
Yeah, I would say, if I should single out one thing I have learned over the past 15 years, it is that free speech and tolerance, which I think is interconnected, and I can explain why if you're interested, is far more fragile than I expected back in 2005. In fact, I thought back then that free speech had rather deep roots, and of course they do have deeper roots in Denmark than in Russia, Turkey, or China, but free speech is in fact always under threat, because freedom of expression is very counterintuitive in the sense that people do not want to hear things that they don't like, and our instinctive reaction is to shut people down, to switch off the television, unsubscribe a newspaper, leave a room, and so on and so forth. Freedom of expression in many ways goes against human nature, and that's why it is so fragile. It's never a well-established institution. Every generation has to fight for freedom of expression and tolerance, and that's why that I didn't understand that back in 2005. So I'm far more concerned as a foundational, perception, and I think and ever since, I would say within the past 15 years, across the world, freedom of expression has been declined, at least within the past 10 years or so. And the new thing is that it's not only within authoritarian states; it's also in Western Europe and the United States. So freedom of expression is very fragile. It goes against human nature, and we can never take it for granted. I didn't understand that back in 2005.
It's especially important for, of course, many of our listeners and viewers are right now in Latin America, where traditionally free speech has been under threat for more time and more intensely than probably in developed countries, but the same problem exists in developed countries. So talking about developed countries, we could move to the United States, where we have, at least in the past few years, what we call cancel culture. No, the idea that we can or should cancel or damage economically a person for having expressed an opinion in the past. So if somebody doesn't like what you said 1 year ago, 2 years ago, or even 10 years ago, they would go to your employer, or they would go to the people who pay for your services and try to, through creating a public scandal, try to cancel you and try to affect you economically for having expressed an opinion. So is cancel culture in the United States and elsewhere an example of imposing self-censorship to a tyrannic majority?
Well, I think that's one of the consequences of cancel culture. I mean, cancel culture is nothing new. I think it's been around forever. The new thing is that it is being reinforced by digital media, which makes it possible to run mob campaigns against every individual who is on social media, and you can call out people, and you can call on social media for them being fired, or you can go after them and intimidate them, threaten them, call for them being fired, or excluded from their social environment, and so on and so forth. So there are very severe consequences with the existence of social media, of cancel culture, and it's far easier to exercise cancel culture than it used to be. But the mechanisms in and by themselves, I think they have been around forever, and it goes back to what I said earlier, that people basically don't like to listen to opinions, point of views that they disagree with, and that's why, for instance, if you take the United States, I'm a big admirer of the First Amendment, and I think the United States has a very strong protection of freedom of expression within its constitutional law. But the problem is that freedom of speech is not only a matter of law, it's first and foremost a matter of culture. It's a matter of education. It's a matter of educating yourself and learning to live with things that you hate. And in that sense, with young people growing up in the United States, the culture on college campuses with safe spaces, microaggressions, and so on and so forth, makes it very easy to play the offense card or the victim card, or say that you have been offended, and words are violence, and things like that, that contributes to a culture of self-censorship, and in a way also censorship, although it's not coming from the state, which is the usual definition of censorship. So, but the point here is that freedom of expression and tolerance is a matter of culture, not a matter of law. You have freedom of expression protected within the law is a way of codifying norms existing in society. But these norms, to exist, they have to be exercised and challenged every day.
So very interesting. So your argument is basically it's very difficult to fight maybe than cancel culture, because you're not fighting against a state, a tyrannical state. You're fighting against the almost invisible enemy. How do you go about solving cancel culture and censorship, not coming from government directly, but coming from majorities, or coming from at least a very loud minority?
Yeah, I think in a way it's quite similar to what I saw in the Soviet Union with dissidents. I mean, they were cancelled literally. I mean, some of them were killed, or they were exiled, or they could not get published. They could not get jobs, and so on and so forth. And the key to fighting self-censorship, fear, and intimidation is to stand up and speak out. You quoted something I wrote a while ago in the beginning, where I said that if one person stands up alone, it's very easy to destroy him or her. But if you have 1 million people standing up, it's very difficult. So in order to fight cancel culture, we all have to make our contribution to the defense of these people, because no matter what we think of their opinions, we might disagree with them. This is not the right way to manage our disagreements, by canceling or calling for the firing or other kind of punishment of people who are saying things that we don't like.
So what is the price? At what cost does self-censorship and cancel culture come for a society? Are there any consequences? Or do we want freedom of speech just for the sake of having freedom of speech? Or is there a reason why societies that have large degrees of freedom of speech perform better, are richer, have better lives, etc., than countries where freedom of speech is not respected?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, and one of the things that has bothered me over the past 15 years is that there is so little empirical study of this. It's beginning to come now, but there's very little empirical investigation. But we have some data, and I think they indicate that there is a connection between freedom of expression, protection of freedom of expression, prosperity and wealth. There's also a connection between freedom of expression, robust protection of freedom of expression, and a society's ability to solve conflicts without violence. If you go back to the Khartoum crisis, I mean, I used the example with Saudi Arabia or Iran, and said, you know, there is a reason why Denmark, as a small country, is exporting feta cheese to Saudi Arabia. Why they don't produce it themselves? Because we have a competitive environment, and if you have a culture of freedom of expression, I, as an ordinary worker, can challenge my boss if something is being done in the wrong way. That's impossible or very difficult in an authoritarian society where the boss is always right, and you are afraid of pointing to mistakes and things gone wrong. And if you look at the Khartoum crisis, the interesting thing is that all the violence at the height of the Khartoum crisis in 2005 and 6 took place in countries where there was no protection of freedom of expression. Back then, that there was no violence in Western Europe. It was in Afghanistan, Nigeria, the Palestinian territories, Iran, so on and so forth. But not in Denmark, not in the Netherlands, the Western European countries. And I think that is symptomatic and indicates that freedom of expression is an important tool to manage conflict without resorting to violence.
Excellent. I want to move, with the time we have left, I want to move to social media, especially Facebook and Twitter. No? So in one of your Washington Post op-eds, you actually cite Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, who once said that despite himself being of Jewish heritage, he wanted to allow Holocaust deniers on Facebook, saying that free speech is more important than being right. So he was a defender of free speech on Facebook. Well, apparently the tide has turned, and we see massive amounts of private censorship by social media. How do you feel this sudden turn in sentiment? Do you consider Facebook's and Twitter's pseudo censorship as something good or something bad? Can you still hear me?
I lost you for a moment. I lost you for a moment, Olav.
So I want to move to social media, Facebook and Twitter.
Yes, I heard that about Zuckerberg.
Oh. So do you consider Facebook and Twitter as censorship, private censorship, as something good or bad? How do you view this shift from Mark Zuckerberg saying that Holocaust deniers should be allowed on Facebook, and then censoring or moving to a different stance where censoring is normal?
Yeah. In fact, he changed his opinion later. I think this was back in 2017 or so. And I think now Facebook, in fact, is removing Holocaust denial. Well, I think we have to, before we criticize Mark Zuckerberg, and I think you can criticize him and the other tech companies for many things, but this is a very difficult issue. And this is about content moderation. And content moderation at scale is, by definition, impossible to do in a good way. But I think, I mean, I would like to see
We'll be right back with Flemming. So the next few, I think he's back.
They have the right.
The next few questions will be about social media. There he is, Flemming.
Yeah, I think we have to admit that it's very difficult to do this in a proper way. It's really a very difficult task. I don't believe that you can have a global community where several billion people live by the same norms for where the limits of freedom of expression should be. It is different in Denmark than it is in California compared to India, Afghanistan, and other parts of the world. So it's really difficult, and I don't think you can do content moderation good at scale. But as a free speech advocate, I would like to see as few limitations on speech as possible. Though I acknowledge that Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and so on and so forth, they are private companies, and they have the right to moderate content as they wish. And I perfectly well understand that you don't want to have your company space contaminated by Holocaust deniers, QAnon conspiracy theorists, all kinds of white supremacists or racist anti-Semites, and so on and so forth. But I think there is a case to be made for trying to be as tolerant as possible and not use censorship, soft censorship, as a tool to regulate the speech. And I think we are in the process of working out those rules. And I think Facebook has established an oversight board. In fact, a former Danish prime minister is chairing this board, and my former boss at CADEP is on Facebook's oversight board. And I think we'll have to wait and see. But I think that there are some promising things going on. I think they have looked into 5 cases, and they are shortly to make a decision on the exclusion of Donald Trump from Facebook. So they are trying to work out norms in accordance with international human rights, free speech norms, and we'll have to wait and see. I myself am quite critical of international human rights speech norms because I think they are flawed. There's been some review of these norms in recent years that has improved the standing of freedom of expression, but I think the foundation that was laid in the aftermath of World War II, it has inherent flaws when it comes to definition of hate speech and things like that. And if you look at the digital platform today, I think the 2 big challenges when it comes to moderating speech online is hate speech and misinformation. And it's difficult because it's very difficult to define hate speech. You know, one man's hate speech is another man's poetry. What is sacred for me might be blasphemy to somebody else. So you need a very, very narrow definition in order not to make it into a tool in the hands of dictators to shut down dissent. And the same goes for misinformation. If you look at the history, you will see that any oppressive regime uses the tool of misinformation and hate speech. They are the 2 tools of choice when it comes to shutting down dissenting voices. And Vladimir Lenin, right after the Bolshevik coup in 1917, he passed a law banning all newspapers, all non-communist newspapers, exactly with the justification that they were spreading misinformation.
It's very interesting that the politicians abuse or create on purpose misinformation so they can justify later a reduction in free speech to combat, to fight against the misinformation. So you've mentioned on various occasions, and just in a moment ago as well, that one of the problems is that social media doesn't respect borders. I mean, we have social media in a dozen of countries with different norms, and we actually have governments in different countries trying to use bully in a certain way Facebook into adopting more rigorous ways of censorship. No? How do you view this? And isn't the risk of social media, international social media, that the worst and the most tyrannic government can impose their will on the entire platform or platforms?
Yes, but I think Facebook is working on that. But the trend you are referring to is already happening. I think what we are witnessing now is the nationalization of the digital space. You have within United Nations many powerful states trying to pass international law that stipulate national sovereignty over the digital space as on the physical space, and of course every state government would like to control what is being said within its borders, even if it's in the digital space, and this is already going on, and my fear is that we will see more and more of this and not less of this in the coming years. And you are right in the sense, I mean, this is a matter of software. I'm not an expert on this, but I know that at a certain point in time, the big fear in the US was that European Union regulation would be would determine the rules of the game, because the European Union is the global most important regulator in any field. So the kind of regulatory framework that the European Union comes up with, and it's a huge market, might risk being implemented in the United States as well, because we are talking about artificial intelligence. And even though Facebook have maybe 15, 20,000 content moderators, the vast majority of moderation online will be done with the help of artificial intelligence and algorithms, which means that you will try to work out some kind of universal regime. So you are right that it might be a race to the bottom, and it might be the worst common denominator that will come out on top. But I think it would be very difficult for Facebook to do this in a country like the US. I think there will be, powerful pushback. But it is a huge challenge, and we'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
Just a quick question about many constitutions. We have these clauses on postal services, no? That they basically are not allowed to open letters or censor letters in that case. And there was this huge or enormous worry or fear that that postal services, either government postal services and private postal services, would try to regulate free speech by regulating the flow of information. So many constitutions adopted clauses, especially to protect postal services and protecting the secret of letters. So is social media or modern postal service, should we include, besides the postal card, should we include messages on social media or WhatsApp? Or how do you view this comparison between postal services and our modern day communication tools?
Yeah, no, I think well, we can hope that there are smart people out there who can develop software that can protect privacy. But it's clear that all of us have lost some privacy with the digital media, and we have been very foolish, many of us, by not taking necessary precautions to protect our privacy online. I think that is a huge problem, and in the beginning, it looked as if the internet or the digital technology would be a very liberating tool to fight state powers. And I think it still is to some degree, but it's clear that every time you see the invention of a new communications technology, like the printing press, like television, like radio, in the beginning, states find it difficult to control these new technologies, but in every single instance, the state has been able to catch up, and the state ends up in a position to be able to formulate the rules and enforce laws also, and restrictions also in this space. And I think in general privacy has been, a sad victim in this development of the digital technology and the platforms. And I'm pretty sure that the states are doing many things that we don't know about. We remember Edward Snowden back in 2013. If he hadn't come forward, we would never have, maybe later on, but at that time we wouldn't have heard about the kind of close cooperation between the big tech and the government of the United States, surveilling millions of people.
Okay, well, we're gonna go to the questions of the audience. There's a lot of questions, so I'm just gonna kick off right away. I have a question by Robert, and his question is anonymity in the expression of ideas less effective than putting a face behind message?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was sitting on the Danish Free Speech Commission for 2 years, and that was one of our key disagreements. I think in a strong democracy like Denmark, it's easier to insist on people not being anonymous online, and of course you can see all the negative consequences online of anonymity, that people say things that they would never say if they had to appear under their own name or if they were meeting face to face. But the fact of the matter is that in an authoritarian regime, anonymity is a way to protect yourself against the state. So even though I can see the problems with anonymity, I would still protect the right to anonymity because of the consequences of having to reveal your identity in an oppressive environment.
Excellent. There's a few questions about responsibility and how it interacts with freedom of speech. There's one question here by Emily. What consequences could emerge if people do not take responsibility over their own freedom of speech? Or does freedom of speech...
I don't know what the implication is, but I think we are responsible for our speech, and we have the law. I mean, if I'm not a free speech fundamentalist in the sense that I don't think there should be any restrictions on speech. I am in favor of criminalizing incitement to violence. I am in favor of protecting privacy. I don't think the media should have the right to publish whatever they want about a private citizen. So I'm not in favor of unlimited freedom of expression. But I think we have the law, and we are responsible before the law, and we also, we are also responsible in the sense that we have to live with the social consequences of what we say. I think cancel culture implies too heavy social consequences of what we are saying. I think we should be able to have a robust exchange and disagreement, and people. I don't think it should be criminalized to express blasphemy or hateful speech. Not because I think it's nice, but because I think the best way to counter the opinions behind these expressions is not to ban them. I think there are norms within every community. I mean, you have speech norm at your university. There are speech norms at workplaces. In Denmark, it's a little bit different than in Sweden, and so on and so forth. So there are norms, but I am in favor of as much freedom to express your opinions as possible, which implies tolerance. And I said in the beginning that I think that tolerance and freedom of expression are two sides of the same coin. And I think one of the problems in our time is that they are being perceived as opposites, that there is some kind of tension between freedom and tolerance, and that tolerance means either turning the other cheek or being silent, or not saying offensive things. But that's not the definition of tolerance. If you look at the way the concept grew out of the wars of religion in Europe in the 17th century, tolerance basically means the ability to live with things that you hate without using prohibition, violence, intimidation, or threats to shut them up. And that's why freedom and tolerance are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have freedom without tolerance, and freedom means nothing if there is no tolerance for speech.
That's very interesting. It was actually a question, reminded me of a question of one of our audience viewers who asked, how would you define tolerance? But you already answered that question. Excellent. There's another question about...
Maybe I can say a little more, because that was also a big surprise to me when I delved into to the history of the concept of tolerance and the wars of religion in Europe. And you had Protestants and Catholics killing one another for centuries, if not decades, in Europe. And Protestant killed Catholics when they were in a minority, and vice versa. And at a point in time, European societies came to an understanding that maybe we have killed one another for enough time, so we had to work out a concept of tolerance, meaning that even though Catholics were deeply offended by tolerance, they accepted that Protestants could live in their societies without being, persecuted or killed. But it was a very difficult process. I mean, in the beginning, in Catholic societies, Protestants were living in outside the town, and they were having their religious meetings outside town. You have the Schulkirche in the Netherlands, where you have private, secret religious service because you could not do it in public. And today you have Catholics and Protestants living, in the same house or in the same street and in the same part of town. But this was a very long and painful process. And I think it is an indication of the fact that tolerance is very difficult. It's very painful to be exposed to beliefs that you dislike or even hate.
Just another question, very interesting, about the foreign money flowing into Western media. So is there any way we could like analyze the purchase of certain like news publications or whatever in various countries financed by tyrannical governments which are against free speech? Example in Europe, I think maybe in the Netherlands or in Denmark, is the flow of money going into misinformation from Turkish governments, from the Turkish government, from maybe Saudi Arabia. In Latin America, it would be different countries, I imagine. But how would you view the risk of foreign purchases of ads or media or content on the Western democracies?
Well, I think I'm not against foreign money by definition, but I think they should not flow secretly into a country. I think you would need to claim where they come from and explain where they come from. The problem is when these money are flowing in through secret channels and it's not transparent. So this is one point. And another point is the principle of reciprocity. That if we a country or companies in a country can be allowed to invest in our media if we are allowed to invest in their media in the same way. And the problem quite often is that if you take the religious sphere, Saudi Arabia is financing the building of more mosques in Western Europe, but we cannot finance the building of Christian churches in Saudi Arabia. And I think this principle of reciprocity is a good principle or starting point to initiate a debate and conversation about these matters.
Very interesting. There's another question by Gabi Escobar, and she asks, where would you draw the line between hate speech and freedom of speech? We mentioned both. Where would you draw the line?
Yeah, I don't think that there is a clear line, and as I indicated earlier, I don't like the term hate speech because there is no clear definition of hate speech. And for instance, if you take the victims of 9/11 who lost their loved ones, and we know that the attack on 9/11/2001 in New York and Washington was done in the name of Islam. In fact, the perpetrators, or Osama bin Laden, quoted specific passages from the Quran to justify this attack. If the loved ones or the relatives of those who had lost their loved ones in this terrorist attack, if they organized a Quran burning as a way of expressing their sorrow, their anger, their frustration with what happened, would that be hate speech? In another context, you could say that burning the Quran could be hateful speech. So it really matters on context. Is it hate speech to attack pedophiles or express hatred towards pedophiles? So I think it's very, very, very difficult.
I think we lost Flemming for a moment. Let's see if he returns in this very instant. So there's a few other questions left. We have a few minutes left.
Us to counter hateful speech with more speech. instead of criminalizing speech, I would confront those who are saying things with which I disagree or which I find hateful, but I would not ban them. I would not prevent them from having a right to express their opinions, no matter how awful they are, unless they directly incite violence. If people say, go out and kill all the Muslims or all the Jews, I think that is a criminal offense, and that should be banned. But expressing hateful opinions without inciting action, I don't think that should be criminalized. And if you look at history, the prime example here is Weimar Germany. And a common opinion is that if we had just had hate speech laws in Weimar Germany when Hitler was starting his political career, he would never have come to power, and so on and so forth and the whole. But you know what? In Weimar Germany, there were hate speech laws, and Hitler and the editor of Der Stürmer and other Nazis, Joseph Goebbels, they were in fact prosecuted for hate speech against Jews, but it didn't help. And in fact, in some situations, it in fact promoted their political careers, because they got the attention, and they could say, they could say that they were the victims of freedom of expression, and so on and so forth.
So the drawing a line between hate speech and freedom of speech is not necessary, because we shouldn't ban either one of them, no? There's another question about.
I think hate speech by definition is a problematic concept, and look at history. If you look at Egypt, if you look at Russia, Turkey, China, they are using hate speech laws to criminalize dissent. I think it's the wrong way to counter hateful opinions.
Excellent. So we're gonna
counter them by. Yeah.
Sorry. No, you can finish your sentence without a problem.
It's okay. I think I made my point. Or
it's a good point as well. So we're going forward with the last question, and that would be about the pluralism. We have a question from Saif, and the question is, does pluralism come from tolerance? Is the result of tolerance?
Yes, absolutely, yes. And diversity implies tolerance. I mean, without tolerance, you have no diversity. And if you have diversity, you need tolerance in order to be able to the ability to live with point of views with which you disagree. And social democrats, they disagree with conservatives.
Okay, we lost Flemming again in the last few minutes. There he is. So he can finish his answer. Hope he reconnects. There he is. Yeah, you can finish your sentence. We lost you for a moment.
Yeah. Did you hear me?
Just the first phrase. So. Yeah, I think you're back. Maybe you can.
Yeah, I'm back now. I'm back now.
So I give a quick summary of what we lost.
But my point was, tolerance is a precondition for a pluralistic society.
Okay, well, we've run out of time. Time has gone by very quickly. I would very much like to thank you for your participation, for sharing your knowledge with us about free speech. And let's hope that free speech and self-censorship and censorship are reduced over the coming years. And let's hope people will be willing to fight for freedom of speech, even if you don't agree with the opinion of another. So thank you very much, Flemming Rose. It's been a pleasure. It's also been a pleasure for me to have all the participants here available or here present with us. I'm gonna end in Spanish. Quisiera darle un agradecimiento especial para la Fundación Naumann, Centroamérica, Guatractiva, y también quería recordarles que esta actividad ha sido organizado por CADEP, el Centro para el Análisis de Decisiones Públicas de la Francisco Marroquín, y nos pueden seguir en redes, nos pueden visitar en la página, tenemos investigaciones, artículos, etcétera. Entonces, muchas gracias y esperamos que nos vemos pronto. Gracias.
Thank you.
Hoy, el mundo busca cursos en línea. Hoy, el mundo sigue las tendencias del mercado. Hoy, el mundo necesita emprendedores. Hoy más que nunca, el conocimiento se dispersó y la Universidad Francisco Marroquín no cerró, se multiplicó en diversos hogares.